Hello, everyone, and welcome to the War Report. Now, we're going to start. We have some pretty big news about Afghanistan. Things have accelerated rapidly there, but we're going to cover that towards the tail end of the show, so we just have a few smaller things we have to knock out. Probably won't be as long as usual. Now, I always come to eat those words, but we'll see this time. And the main story out of the gate is last Friday, literally hours after we get done recording our previous episode, I see the headline from NBC News that 9/11 families to President Biden don't come to our memorial events. Now, nearly 1,800 of the victims out of, again, the roughly 3,000 victims, which include, of course, the, people on the aircraft, the emergency workers, just the regular employees in, New York at the time at the World Trade Center, are frustrated with Biden and have put out a statement saying we don't want you at the memorials because if you're going to keep covering up for Saudi Arabia and not release these files after 20 years, it's time. I don't care what national security concerns you have or whatever canned excuse you're going to give us. You're just stalling at this point, which you've seen this rhetoric pick up, I would say, since about 2016, 2017. I would say it coincides with the Trump era, maybe even back in 2015, where really people started to distrust the regime to the levels that they do now. And like I said, I say Trump, at least rhetorically, was a pretty big part of it. Now, Trump didn't outright say a lot of this stuff, but he, I would say, facilitated these sort of discussions to the point where by 2017 you had several senators saying, well, why not, you know what, we need to release these files. You had pieces put out in mainstream outlets saying, the Saudi embassy had weird ties to all of these hijackers who entered the country mere months before committing this terrorist attack. So, yeah, again, like various things that pointed out, the big story, it was out of some British media outlet, I can't remember which one, was that the Saudi embassy had ties to what they called the practice run, where, of course, they boarded a plane and they cased the joint, so to speak, saw what security at a cockpit was on a 767, again, saw how easy it would be to smuggle on contraband, etc. And again, people have more or less accepted from the past 5 years onward that Saudi Arabia played a significant, if not major, role in this whole fiasco. Now, that was always speculated before. It was a talking point of a lot of the liberals and the anti-war crowd. Not necessarily that wrong. I think the angle they approached it from was a bit weird, particularly after Iraq and into the late Bush era, where they would criticize Bush's ties to Saudi Arabia in light of everything like that, and of course with the just chaos of the Bush years, with of course Iraq and Afghanistan, the war on terror, the Patriot Act, just the entire cultural zeitgeist around that era. And it's culminated in, of course, these families saying, no, we don't want you at these events. And then what comes out on the Monday afterwards, this Monday the 9th, is Biden approves the DOJ move to conduct, quote, fresh review of Saudi officials' role in September 11th, after families tell him not to come to the 20th anniversary memorials. Now, look, I open with this qualifier all the time, and you'll probably have better insight in terms of what it like was from a first-hand account. But as somebody with admittedly no memory of 9/11, just what I know about the era and what I know about the cohesion of the country, I would say in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, pretty much up until war with Iraq became debated, it was complete unity. Bush was like between 70 and 90% approval rating, just depending on the day. Like after the attacks, he was at like 90 something percent approval. And the idea that in 2001, 2002, or even 2003, that you would have a group of victims and their families telling the president not to go would have been unthinkable. I think it shows what we've really been hitting on for these past couple years doing the show here, the last few years doing the show here, of the absolute disillusion of the cohesion of a nation. Because before then, you would think that, like, okay, politics aside, personal views aside, whatever, he's the head of state. This is supposed to be a moment of so-called unity. But I think it shows a fundamental breakdown that we've been touching on for such a long time now, especially over this past year. The fact that even if it's officially over the Saudi Arabia stuff that they said, we don't want you here. We don't want people from your administration here. We want to, again, mourn in our way. We want to have this memorial in our way, and we couldn't give less of a damn about what federal officials have to say, especially in light of them more or less running cover for one of the main accomplices of the attack 20 years ago. And again, I think that's probably an overarching reason. I think there's probably more particular reasons just when it comes to the current political and cultural condition of the United States. But I still think, again, even just imagining with as rabid anti-Trump the liberals were in, of course, his first term, 2017, 2018, or even like the early Obama years when you had the big Tea Party movement where they were saying like Obama is the illegitimate president. We need 1776 Part Two. Like I still don't think there would have been many, if at all, of them who would have criticized him or asked him to stay away from an event like this. So I think it shows. I I don't think it's a significant event in and of itself. This isolated incident, of course, it's a story. Don't get me wrong, but I think when you take into account with everything else that has happened since the attack, I think it's a watershed moment, so to speak.
I agree. It is unprecedented. I think 9/11, in many ways, is the first significant event to create enormous doubt in the American public with its in a way that I would say surpasses the Kennedy assassination. And it's the next big on this trajectory of distrust in the government, of feeling that you are a part of a state craft. And I think there's a lot of people that were on the edge and still are on the edge, that there was no intention to let it happen, but it was it was used with malicious purpose.
And you see
But
that
and I
that's the
now
big lose-lose situation for the regime, and I will touch on this extensively in about a month when we do our episode dedicated to this. Where okay, it's either a deliberate, in which case you just allowed a one of the largest terrorist attacks in history outside of one, I would say, mass casualty event of civilians outside of, for example, like a war zone, like a total war zone. I'm talking like World War I, World War II. That it's either okay, you deliberately let that happen to your own people, or B, the strongest empire history has ever seen, the most powerful country in the world, couldn't see this happen right under their noses. So it's damned if you do, damned if you don't.
right, and it really did end an era, because like many people, I immediately started researching. Uh, uh, who were these guys, and what was their history, and how long had they been in the country, and where did they live before, and it went on and on and on. And it looks like, I mean, there were several well corroborated stories of literally the FBI living next door with some of the hijackers in Florida, and at one time being closely followed in Germany when they were living there prior to moving to America. Uh, so, I mean, you know, the guy, I think, if you want to have the most sober and straightforward argument about prior knowledge of 9/11, to go to Rye Doss. Don't get tangled up in the whole thing about whether it was a missile or a plane, the Pentagon, and all that. Um, in prior knowledge can be very well defended, and that also includes the six that were arrested,
Yeah, and
and arrested
I
till
certainly
November.
don't want to get too far into this because I think we might spoil our audience a little
Yeah,
bit. But I've discussed a lot of this before. In fact,
right.
our last year episode when we did
Yeah,
this, Amdocs was the other really big one, which is the telecommunication company based out of Tel Aviv. that, at least at the time, and I think still does, handled most American calls to the point where if you were placing a phone call within the United States, it was going through Amdocs and of course, and also with Israeli laws, with their security laws. Of course, they kept documentation on all these phone calls that went through. Now, you could do the plausible deniability defense, the needle in the haystack defense that, well, with millions upon millions of calls, how could they have filtered out these ones? Now, admittedly, that is true, but at the point where, again, you have this massive, what is fundamentally an intelligence ring on one of the most populated countries in the world, one of the richest countries in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. From everyone, probably from the highest ranking people, president, congressman, members of the president's cabinet, other politicians, billionaire celebrities, all the way down to your plebeians, your blue collar workers, etc. Again, they probably had more or less extensive documentation on all of their conversations, especially the people higher up, especially these strange people who have these strange ties to Saudi Arabia and this international organization that's cropped up over the past 10, 15 years called Al Qaeda. You know, the fact that they might monitor their phone calls and have records of that, that's completely unbelievable. That's conspiracism. I will not tolerate any of it.
Right. Right. And this is not a very workable approach, right? Um, the commission on 9/11 was one of the most heavily redacted. Uh, it had one of the most heavily redacted uh, evidentiary processes. Since the Kennedy assassination, right? So, what I think it's a veiled threat against Saudi Arabia. The truth is that if they really investigate this, um, they will uncover, let's say, failure of intelligence or complicity in America and in Israel.
And that's just to name a few. I mean, for
I don't think
example, as
it's
you were saying, they stayed in Germany. The MI6, also a very powerful intelligence agency with its tentacles all over the world. So I would probably implicate multiple Western governments and so-called allies in that case.
right, right, and their communications had already been intercepted, anyways. So one of them was to fly 12 planes over the Pacific and crash them, right? So, um, I would say that it's immensely unworkable, and they are needlessly, like, it's just political pandering. Biden is not serious. He's not going to disclose Saudi Arabian involvement in this, right?
Oh, of course not. And like you said,
I don't
any
think.
move towards that is leverage because of Saudi Arabia's most recent deals, of course, with the Chinese. And as I believe it was
Right.
2019, about 2 years ago now, where Saudi Arabia said that we're going to start selling oil in the yuan. And again, it just gets
Yeah.
down this whole rabbit hole. Now, I just want to leave that as a teaser for what we have for you about a month from now. In order to discuss that
Yeah.
stuff, because we're going to go very deep into that and very deep in that entire topic. But moving on from that, we have a little bit of other news we want to cover before we get too much into the Afghanistan stuff. So, South Korea and the United States have revamped their annual military drills. And this is no surprise under the Biden administration, especially as tensions rise in East Asia, especially with China, and negotiations between the two Koreas are in a very strange state right now because just weeks prior to this, you had some thawing out of relations that you haven't seen in about a couple of years now between North and South Korea. But then all of a sudden they decide to hold these drills again. Of course, probably at the behest of the United States, because I doubt South Korea was too particular requesting these, because, again, I think Moon doesn't seem like the type in order to do that. But the main press out of that, of
Yeah.
course, is Kim Yo Jong, who is Kim Jong Un's sister, has gained fame or notoriety, if you will, in the past years, especially when it was speculated that he may have died in surgery, and she was a speculated successor to it. Of course, they were all over the media with her profiles, and of course, to the of course state media of North Korea, she said they are the most vivid expressive expression of U.S. hostile policy designed to stifle our state by force and an unwelcoming act of self-destruction for which a dear price should be paid as they threaten the safety of our people and to further imperil the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Of course, we will spur we will put more to spur further increasing of the deterrence of absolute capacity to cope with the ever-growing military threats in the U.S., i.e., national defense capabilities and powerful preemptive strike for rapidly countering any military action against us, so on and so forth. So, in isolation, this isn't that big of a news event, but it is showing a deterioration of what had been done over about the past 3 years now. With Trump's mild successes in diplomacy with North Korea, it looks like that is more or less regressing back to what it was in the Obama era, if not earlier. And again, the differences between the late Bush, early Obama era with North Korea's nuclear program is North Korea is an established nuclear state at this point. They're not as in a desperate situation as they were in the late 90s, early 2000s, especially now. They're opening relations with China and Russia, whereas before they were very isolated. And again, I doubt this will signal the end of inter-Korean dialogue, but it's certainly going to stifle it. And again, not to sing the praises of Trump too much, but I think it is the consequence of a Biden world that this is happening because, as I say all the time, you had Trump come in, at least rhetorically break all the toys and make everyone look like an ass, for better or for worse. Don't get me wrong. And then you
Mm-hmm.
have the Build Back Better, let's get serious, let's get back to normal Biden administration come in. And you can just go back and watch our show since January. It's been. Can you name one even mild Biden foreign policy success? Okay, he tried to reconcile with Iran. That kind of worked, but did it? His outreach to Russia and his even more schizophrenic policy on Russia than Trump had. China, I couldn't even tell you what his foreign policy is over there because, of course, it started out it was going to be China Joe. He was going to be their guy in the White House, similar to the Trump collusion story. But then he comes out of the gate talking about how we need to stand up to China. And again, that's been something he hasn't even been all over the place on, but more or less hasn't taken an official stance. Of course, he's following through with the Trump peace plan in Afghanistan, which is odd to say the least. And of course, I have my speculations behind that. His strikes in Syria are more or less a continuation of the Trump-Obama policy. But again, I wouldn't even say so much as foreign policy failures of Biden, but I'm going to go back to using the term I called him at the beginning of his administration, the first few months. The absentee president. Where the hell is he? It seems
Yeah.
like it seems like the U.S. administration, not just Biden, of course, Biden is an aged man, probably is in a state of mental decline. Now, of course, I'm no doctor, I'm no expert, so I'm not saying that definitively. But again, even with Kamala and Blinken doing these diplomatic events and state visits, etc., I think it's just testament to the current geopolitical situation in the United States that we seem so detached from everything right now. Again, not that I want my finger in every pie, not that I want to be involved around the world. In fact, I think the more imperial traction, the better. But I think the circumstances, especially under which is happening right now, is very foreboding. I've been very clear about that several times before, especially in our conversations about Afghanistan. But looking at all of this going forward is all of a sudden you get a show of might in the Korean Peninsula, and people have speculated with the withdrawals from Afghanistan that's going to lead to escalations elsewhere in the world. Perhaps it's stuff like that. Perhaps, a lot of people have speculated East Asia, of course, which wouldn't be a surprise. But again, this is the first real significant move Biden has taken in East Asia. A lot of the tensions you've seen were, strangely enough, between either the British and the Chinese or the Japanese and the Chinese. And it's been more or less the USA in absence and just us taking a sidelined role. And I'm really curious how that's going to continue going forward because I can't imagine that we're going to get to a point in the future where we don't have to quote unquote put our foot down and make our mark. That Russia or China or even a smaller mid-sized power like Iran is going to do something that gets egg on our face, and we have to maybe not like an actual response, but a symbolic or rhetorical response. But I'm just wondering how much this time in quote unquote hiding can continue from not only Biden but the American empire as a whole, because that's what it seems like. Now, of course, like I said, we've had our actions since then, but compared to what they were even under Trump, and Trump was one of the less hawkish presidents we've had in the past 50 years, I would say it's a strange dynamic to say the least.
Yeah, well, I mean, Biden is has kind of a caretaker role. His two main tasks are to prolong Trump and Obama policies while basically discrediting the Trump presidency. Those are the two main tasks he has to deal with. He has not been any more successful than Trump has in his, foreign adventures. um, Even Cuba now has, of course, he has managed, I think, to rein in the EU, and Cuba is a good example because anytime there was a vote in the UN about embargoes, every EU country voted against America. The embargo, saying it was inhumane, and this time they were quiet about it, and basically saying that the protests and the embargoes are two different things, and so everybody knows they're not. So I would say he has reined in the EU um, to some extent, but overall, his stance with Russia, Iran, China are no different. And just to circle back to Korea, I would say that particularly now in 2021, more than ever, if Japan is America's carrier next to China, then definitely Korea is a beachhead and they cannot leave. Um, it's an important show of intimidation, even though the relationship with with China and North Korea is often strained, and often North Korea has a better relationship with with Russia. The fact is both in both circumstances, America and Russia, and so it only adds more reason to justify their entrenchment in South Korea. So I also think the societies in many ways, they've developed on such different grounds, really, in a way, even more extreme are they divided compared to what Germany went through.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely, and I think
I mean, it's been
yeah, it's
30
been
years, more than 30 years.
it's been wild. I've been seeing some stuff on South Korea about like their general culture when it comes to employment and education, how strenuous it is, even just on people who are like just still in secondary school to the point where you have these like 16-year-old kids getting like 4 nights sleep, and again you have this country that's fundamentally the epitome of a neoliberal technocratic hellhole, but just 100 miles north of the border you have a country that's stuck in 1948, and that's practically a carbon copy of the Stalinist Soviet Union, and for better or for worse. And again, I think a lot of what we hear out of North Korea is atrocity propaganda, of course, to play on the heartstrings. But point being is, you have this very rigid structure, militaristic, industrial society. It seems like again, it's sort of the two logical conclusions to both of these extremes. Again, this like neoliberal, maximum growth, infinite economy, strong sort of ideology to the south, and then this idea of a strong structured, industrialized, militaristic state to the north. And frankly, as time goes on, like I'm not saying I'd want to live in either, but North Korea seems like it has a more stable model for society and civilization. It seems like ironically enough, the communist quote unquote left wing state has a much more traditional society with the strong patriarchal autocrat, that in the Kim family, where again it's still a very male dominated society, whereas in South Korea it's gone almost completely feminist with I think to the point where like there's these schizo posts, which I mean may or may not be true. I honestly haven't done enough to look, where it's pretty much the secret cabal of feminists that will control every South Korean government, have all these influence over these politicians. But again, it's night and day between the two, to the point where it's
Yeah.
like, both seem like hellholes. One's easier to escape at least, but it seems like in terms of long-term survival, you'd want to be North Korean, and that's even down to just the total fertility rate. North Koreans have more children than South Koreans. It's not above replacement rate, but I think the birth rate of South Korea is like point 0.9 something, whereas in North Korea it's 1.93. And like I said, realistically, I think it shows the merits of the 20th century authoritarian state in comparison to
Right.
neoliberal hell. And I think that's quite an impressive feat. Now, again, I'm no libertarian. I'm no like quote unquote small government conservative. I've moved on a lot past a lot of that. But there were excesses in these 20th century regimes, and it's quite a feat in order to make that look like a more stable form of society.
I'm really glad you brought that up because, one of the things that I've been thinking about is, there was this sort of Goldilocks period where after the fall of the Soviet Union, you could literally believe in anything was possible. That certainly was the atmosphere after that happened. People really did believe that differences could be worked out and that, all of Europe would have a brighter future. America would have a brighter future. And if there was trouble somewhere, Russia and Eastern Europe would be there to help and so on. But what you really, I would say after like 2010, 2013, 14, basically, I'm talking about the rise of China. China is an example of an authoritarian state that is, by all metrics, successful. Now, I'm not, there's things about Chinese culture. I'm not going to get into them that I don't like. But for them, you know, these aspects of their culture have always been there and have nothing to do with like CCP this or the communist or like
Yeah,
none of that
believe
crap.
it or not, I mean, you get into some of the stuff about in China's internal politics. The CCP is actually a moderating force that keeps down like pretty much what can only
Yeah.
be described as Han supremacists who believe in like absolute Han Chinese domination of the globe. Again, you hear a lot of stuff like the Communist Party, and again, I have very nuanced thoughts on China as I do many things, but it's funny because what the Chinese Communist Party censors have had to deal with in recent years, I would say, funny enough, since the rise of Xi Jinping, is censoring more nationalistic material, censoring material that's deemed "quote unquote" too right wing for again the Chinese state. And but you do have a point that China and to a degree Putin's Russia, and then you want to get into some of the smaller examples, Orban's Hungary, that these illiberal states can not only survive but can thrive and keep their pace with the end of history regimes, with the
Right.
neoliberal United States and UK, and in some cases can outmaneuver them, as we've seen in geopolitically at least Syria, um, Ukraine, etc. One could say Hong Kong in that
Mhm.
regard, and even in internal politics when you look at what the priorities of these societies are. Again, you don't have to like Russia or China. You don't have to like a country or leader to be able to admire it and point to objectively would work. Turkey is another good example of this. I'm no fan of the Turks. I'm no fan of Erdogan, but I think he has a very workable model to have a conservative take back of a country to the point where he moves these conservative ruralites into the cities, puts them in these position of powers, disempowers these liberal urbanites from the country. He's done this to Ankara. Not so much to Istanbul, but Ankara and other major urban areas in Turkey. He's done this to a T. And I would say he's actually done better at this. I mean, of course, he had much more to fight back against when it comes to China or Russia, which were just inherently less liberal, had less exposure to that, being isolated from the Western bloc, the Western sphere. But point being is, these people show that there's a way to have a thriving functional society that exists outside of this 20th century, 21st century liberal mythology. And not only down to raw geopolitical interests does it bother these people, but on some level it is ideological. It is ideas based. The fact that well, no, we said none of this could work. No, we said strong governments and autocratic leaders and strongmen. None of that could work in the 21st century. It's an era of democracy and plurality and egalitarianism. And it's like, okay, these countries aren't perfect. Of course, they're not as wealthy as the United States or many Western countries, but they're functional societies that at least have a trajectory, that have their priorities in order, that care to some degree. Now it varies about their nation, in some cases religion, depending on which ones you're talking about, their demographics, the really an autarkic policy where, yeah, the economy is important, but they're more concerned about sustainability and creating a self-enclosed loop than just GDP go up. And
Right,
yeah,
right,
but again, just to my final point on all of that is it shows that there is another way for people both inside and outside of the West.
right. And the West in America is caught in a vice right now. On the one hand, um, they have to disprove that, right? They have to disprove that's not true. Even after China eclipsed the UK and all these other economies that were ahead of it 15, 20 years ago, right? And on some metrics, it's equal to America. And many are predicting by 2024 it will surpass America by a sliver. The other thing is by 2024, SWIFT, an alternative, will be developed. So sanctions will be more meaningless. And what you will essentially have is like, you know, another world with its own order, having carved out this space. But I do think, like, one of the things that lately that I've been thinking about with reference to this is a little bit of like Nick Land's ideas about accelerationism and the way he describes the ahistorical moment of the Renaissance and how even the concept of zero, which let's say India had, China had, did not disrupt their societies. And he goes further on to say that zero as a concept and whatever this modernity, which first seeped in during the Renaissance, it disrupted and changed Western society, particularly Northwestern society, in a way that no other society has till then. And in his analogy, he talks about like this is like a nuclear plant, and the graphite rods are being removed. And the more you do this, the more something chaotic is going to blow up. And the role of the regime is to stop this. So I would say there's a very deep question and a cycle, a kind of a time loop that's happening right now, in that those graphite rods, so to speak, as they were pulled out, did not cause the end of Western civilization. Now they moved it to another stage, and there were several revolutions and the bloodiest wars possible. But what they did is they set up capitalism, for instance, right? They set up an entirely different way to do accounting, science. Everything was changed. All kinds of new magnitudes were conceivable where they couldn't be conceived before. Again, because of zero and because of the Roman numeral system being replaced. But you see that, again, in Arabic societies, this concept did not do the same thing. So so there was something quite unique with what happened in the Renaissance, with what it had imported, that in three other major world civilizations it had not done. It did not have the same effect. And so what we're seeing now is we're seeing like this system actually, and its preconceptions about its universality. Think of the anti-LGBTQ protests in Georgia recently. Think Iran, the Islamic Revolution, how it's still holding on. And think of the rise of China, and in a sense, the rebirth of Russia, because it's no good like comparing Russia to Italy's economy. Russia punches way, way above Italy. And there are many reasons for that. And the other thing to keep in mind is Russia by now was supposed to have been this balkanized state. And that didn't happen. And so what you have is this challenge to these presumptions of modernity. And, you brought up Erdogan, that's another example. And I would characterize that as regimes looking at what is happening in the West and saying, we must figure out on a more illiberal way of repressing this, or else it will do what it is doing in America and what it's doing in the Anglosphere and what it's doing in Western Europe. So, yeah. So I think, again, to circle back to Korea, America, I think, is very invested in those two countries not resolving their differences unless they go, along American lines. There's no room there for negotiation whatsoever, and I think it's like there's a reason. I mean, even if it was resolved, why would you need American troops there? Like I said, it's a beachfront. This is the beachfront for American presence in Asia. It's very close to China. It can monitor them there. And it also keeps a tab on the far eastern Russia portion. So, yeah, we're in sort of, the 11th hour right now about these very big ideological questions and these very big questions about civilization and these ideas, these lines of ideas that come and affect the civilization for a very long time.
Certainly, and with that being said, with the crossroads of civilization and these big questions being asked, we have quite a bit of Middle Eastern news, mostly centering on Afghanistan, and we just have a few small topics before that. We'll get into our news about Iran first, which the new Iranian president, of course, Raisi, has called for talks with Macron for nuclear cooperation, for some salvaging of the nuclear deal, after these talks have stalled with the West, of course. And with what we saw here is, again, Iran is still giving some credence to these Western powers, thinking that maybe the sanctions can be lifted now, especially that Trump's out of office and that Biden is much more malleable on these issues, if you will. But I mean, even just reaching out to Macron, reaching out to France, what I think is a bit of a strange move. Not that Macron has completely capitulated to the American empire, if you will, but he's much more in line with it than he was under Trump. He's much less of the Jupiterian figure he was trying to portray himself as before any of this. And it looks like, again, the Iranians are more or less trying to keep this diplomacy going. Of course, it's after the so-called tanker incidents that happened recently, of course, off the Gulf of the UAE and Oman. And of course, the Iranians must have seized those tankers. Of course, the IRGC must have done that. And again, we're getting into that territory where it looks like, I guess, they want to just kick the can down the road for another 5 years and just hope that this new liberal government, this new democratic government, will just give them the deal that Obama gave them, even though it is a bit of a strange contrast for the Iranians because, of course, under Rouhani at least, and this may have just been electioneering, you have this rhetoric that we can no longer trust these people, we can no longer trust the United States government, we can no longer trust any of this, and that they will betray us and that they will stab us in the back, which, I mean, I don't think is completely unfounded sentiment on the part of the Iranians. And we more or less speculated that Iran would be a nuclear state within the next few years now. But I guess they're trying one last-ditch effort for negotiation with Western powers before they pursue that path. Or, again, maybe there's some broader angle to this that I'm just not seeing right now. But it just seems fruitless that Raisi wants to try to continue these talks at this point.
Right, and there's also pressure coming from Israel, of course. I think it was Blinken that either it was either Blinken or someone else. Now they've gone to Israel to meet with the Mossad and with Bennett. Uh, so there's the issue of the tanker. The Pentagon has released a statement saying that uh, the drone attack originated from Yemen, and they believe it was an Iranian drone. I mean, well, how do you prove that? And sorry, yeah, it's the distance is quite a bit if you take a look at a map as to where it happened. That's a lot of air to cover. But besides that, America is also going to be putting pressure on China and Russia to stop selling weapons to Iran. So it could be that Iran is also looking for a partnership with European states like France in order to have some leverage against the United States. That's understandable. The other is, of course, Iran has its own economic problems. It has its issues with the sanctions, and I don't think that Iran is insincere about this deal. I do think they want it. I think they're very well aware that they're surviving for now. Of course, as we discussed on other programs, they are going to eventually be brought into the Shanghai Agreement, which will be a big deal. They have a huge loan, an infrastructure project from China, and they are buying weapons from Russia. So there is alleviation, but I think for Iran, there's also resentment that so many of their funds are frozen, just as they are with the Venezuelans. And I think that's a sore spot, and I think they want that back. Could I mean, could Iran develop nuclear weapons? Yeah, of course. Will they? I don't know. I mean, they say they won't, but the pragmatic in me will probably say yes. But for the moment, I mean, they're not. There's no proof that they are. And Israel through Netanyahu has been saying this for over 20 years. And still no nuclear weapons. So it is a deal that America backtracked on, and Iran is right to pursue it. But the game is very different right now. 2016 there was pressure, but there's a lot more pressure now. The pressure is only going to build in the next 2, 3, 4 years.
Oh, certainly, and you could be right. They might be looking for some sort of release valve to that pressure, trying to get some sort of patchwork agreement in there. Maybe they're not anticipating even less, but again, trying to
Mhm.
have some fail-safe, have some at least event that might stall anything from getting worse for them, and something to, again, more or less buy them some time. Now, with that being said, we can move on to our news in Syria, which is much lighter than, of course, our Afghan news, which I've been teasing all episode. So we will go ahead and take care of that. So, with what we have in Syria here is continued shelling by pro-government and pro-Syrian forces around the Idlib province. Now, there has been some retaliations. They have struck back these groups. There's been, again, some casualties on mainly the opposition side around Idlib in northwestern Syria. Of course, you had Kurdish skirmishes with escaped ISIS prisoners, Turkish activities in northeastern Syria. The Iranians lost a drone, actually, strangely enough, near that Turkish territory, and of course, violence near the Syrian-Jordanian border. And Israel also making it very clear that they had nothing to do with the tanker fire in Latakia earlier this week. So,
Mhm.
certainly, just coming out and putting that out there and covering your own ass. Whatever. Hey, it's whatever. But again, out of Syria, there's not much news. Just the grip around Idlib tightens ever so slightly every day. The last summer of Idlib, as it were. Even though As I believe it was Bob the Builder said in the comments section, that the Afghan National Army will certainly collapse before Idlib does, and I 100% agree with that assessment. Last summer, the Afghan Army, I guess, but that's aside the point. We'll get into that. Just give me a couple minutes. And again, with Syria, things are just crawling along as usual. I thought a few months ago, that we were in for something big in Syria, even up until a few weeks ago when they were talking about the so called, again, plots for chemical attacks in Idlib, of course, the Russian Foreign Ministry, which is very overzealous about these sort of claims, especially in recent years, saying, oh, they're plotting some sort of false flag to justify intervention in Idlib. I think most of the attention of this part of the world, even though Middle East, Central Asia, there is a fundamental bit of separation to them, is focused on Afghanistan. And I think that's bought some time for the Syrians. I think that'll let them do what they need to do in Idlib. I think this entire past 2 years has bought a lot of time for the Syrians. Ever since the Trump teased pulling out in late 2018 through 2019, that actually did. And then when he really let the Turkish have more rain in Syria, that also led to, again, a lot of pressure being taken off of Assad, off of his backers
Yeah.
and his allies, and to the point where, again, I'm just in shock every time, every week I come back here and see that small sliver of one of the most heavily controlled rebel opposition pockets of the entire Syrian civil war just shrinking further and further and further every time I look at it. It is a bit surreal, I will admit, just observing the situation over the past 5 6 years.
Yeah, as you say, it is shrinking, and there's been some infighting again between HTS and other rival groups. I don't know if they've managed to patch things up with the Chechens that are there. A lot of people don't know, but they estimate between 7 to 9,000 Chechens from Russia have gone there, and well over 5 to 6,000 Uyghurs have also gone there. So you can understand the concern that China and Russia have for these, ostensibly rebels fighting a civil war in another country that isn't theirs. Um, I will say that everything from the heavy fighting between the Palestinians, Hamas, and the Israelis, as you say, gave Syria some small breathing room for a couple of weeks, and it did so also recently with shelling being exchanged back and forth uh, between Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Israel. It's so this kind of multi-front. These multi-front attacks are keeping Israel occupied, and of course, they have a potential, another COVID outbreak. They're expected to go into lockdown in September. And of course, things are winding down for Erdogan. At the moment, what's his name? His name just Bolton. So Bolton is creating an NGO and a think tank in order to deal with Turkey. Well, it's there to basically just oust Erdogan. And they are, I think, very intent on doing this, which is going to force Erdogan to play nice with Russia and, by extension, with Syria. And this will be a boon for the Kurds in some ways if he comes through. If he doesn't, he will risk everything. And now he's a hot-headed guy, and it could be just that. But remember that it was the Russians that warned him that there was a coup being executed back in 2016. Funnily enough, the Americans didn't warn him. But in any case, I would say that I think in the next 5 6 months we're going to see some pretty big changes in Syria, and if we don't, we're going to see bigger changes in Turkey. In other words, expect mobilization for mass protests, uh, political challenges, all of that kind of thing.
Oh, certainly. I think that is one element that is overlooked. I wasn't aware of John Bolton's newest excursion until you informed me of that. Who knew that Turkey would replace Ire for Iran? And, you know, credit where credit is due, I guess, because that's a much more realistic view of the world on his part. But it is still typical of John Bolton, as one would say. But speaking of John Bolton's lament, would you like to talk about Afghanistan now?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Oh, certainly. Okay, so Kandahar, known mainly for, of course, its heavy U.S. presence over the course of the Afghan war, has fallen to the Taliban. It is the 12th regional capital to fall to the Taliban. And you'll see on this map, everything in green is Taliban and affiliated control. The stuff in gray and white inside the Afghan borders is disputed territory being fought over. And anything in blue is the Afghan government and their backers, such as the United States, NATO, etc., to the point where you don't see any blue on the map unless you really zoom into Kabul, which isn't really a surprise for Afghanistan, but they are just sweeping across the country. People were speculating that it's going to be a final stroke of irony when on September 11th, 2020 is going to be the day that they take Kabul, which, I mean, at this rate, that's not an unrealistic time frame. About a month from now is not an unrealistic time frame for that at all. But looking at what we have here is, I mean, things are going. I wouldn't even call it downhill because fundamentally not so much is changing in Afghan society. They're still being ruled by tribal Muslim warlords. It's just the question of which ones and who their loyalties are owed to. Now, of course, the Taliban has been on its diplomatic tour. It's been on its internal quote-unquote reforms, I guess you could say, where becoming a much less rigidly posturing group. They made guarantees to the Iranians that they wouldn't make incursions in their country and support quote unquote sympathetic groups there. However, an Iranian drone was downed over, I believe it was somewhere in northwestern Afghanistan. An Iranian drone was shot down by presumably Taliban forces. They've made a tentative deal with China, and this is a little bit of old news, but again, it just got brought up again that they would fight Uyghur militants within the country of Afghanistan. They made that agreement to the Chinese. And what you really have here is the U.S. is, of course, doing its farewell strikes. They're dropping bombs on whatever targets they can. However, and as the mainstream media was saying, well, we're striking all these targets. Why hasn't it slowed the advance of the Taliban? Why hasn't the completely incompetent ground forces, even if they're backed up by these B-52s, why hasn't it halted the advance to the point where you have entire Afghan units just completely defecting, just completely giving up, and really going home because there's nothing worth fighting for in this regime, and in some cases defecting. The ones who are dedicated enough to the quote-unquote cause have been executed as prisoners, and the U.S. Embassy, of course, came out and strongly condemned that. And with everything else going on, they are now making requests and even trying to bribe the Taliban to let the U.S. staff at the embassy in Kabul go peacefully, because we still have not evacuated the embassy at this point. And this is something that should have been done when this Taliban sweep across the country could have started. Maybe they're going to use this as some sort of PR propaganda, sacrifice these State Department bureaucrats on the altar of whatever the hell their next goal is. Maybe this will be Biden's Benghazi, as it were. Maybe that's what they're trying to build this up as. And except I don't even think the Republicans are indignant enough nowadays to even do what they did in Benghazi. I think their fighting spirit has been more or less broken, except on very few key issues, and I don't think that would be one of them. But Afghanistan, more or less, you have the European Union calling for sanctions and calling not to recognize the legitimacy of the Taliban government, and all of what is happening is what I expected, but at the rate in which it is happening is where I get thrown through a loop. That's where I'm at right now, at the point where None of this is surprising, but the fact that this is happening over the course of 3 months is shocking.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, I mean, I expected things to go quickly, and I'll be honest, and it is happening quickly, but I'm still surprised how quickly. It's still a shock if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And again, you also see to the point where it's not going to be in the 90s like it was in the 90s with the Taliban controlled Afghanistan. The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, as they officially call themselves, is going to be this pariah state. Now, again, I doubt they're going to be a modern functional state that is diplomatic on the world stage, but it doesn't seem like you had, outside of course, the European Union making their statements, you don't seem to have this broad condemnation of them that you saw in the 90s, where various countries were supporting these insurgent groups and supporting the Northern Alliance, etc. Speaking of which, you did have Russia doing drills on the Tajik and other Central Asian countries' borders. I don't believe they were joint drills, but you had these Russian border guards just doing drills. These Russian border guards that aren't there to protect the border, even though I would say they probably are. They don't want this spilling over. And you look at all of this happening right now, and it's really emblematic, isn't it, of the
Hmm.
past 20 years. And I think we'll have a lot more to say about this when we do our big episode in about a month. That neither of us, we both had to eat our words on this. Neither of us, up until the day it actually happened, thought that withdrawal from Afghanistan was ever going to happen, at least in history. We thought there would be some sort of official withdrawal where, of course, we get out, countries crawling with mercenaries, still completely within our sphere of influence, the Taliban is suppressed. But no, that hasn't happened at all. And, of course, you had people who were, I'd say, a bit more on the paranoid side, saying, "Oh, we're not really getting Afghanistan. Look at what our air force is doing." I mean, these are more or less just farewell shots. This is we're trying to save face as we run with our tail between our legs out of this country by dropping a few bombs to look good for our allies across the world, and it, it's really just a fruitless effort at this point. And I mean, I'm at the point where probably come October, it's more or less going to be Taliban victory. I don't think there's going to be any real remnant of resistance against them. I don't think we're going to have any real, again, sort of Northern Alliance type movement. Now, of course, we'll see how the dynamic between Pakistan, China, Iran, and the other neighboring powers, we'll see how they conduct themselves in Afghanistan. But it's gotten to the point, like I said, where even China has more or less said, yeah, we'll accept Taliban rule, tit for tat. They can take care of the Uyghurs there. We won't interfere too much in there. Of course, we'll do the investments that we do. And it really does make you wonder with all of it what the strategic purpose even was. Even from the idea of like what the real purpose was. Of course,
Hmm.
officially it was root out Al Qaeda, and then which later became nation building. But at least with Iraq, when they said overthrow Saddam, get rid of the weapons of mass destruction, build democracy, okay, that was an obvious farce. But people more or less had the idea of why we were invading Iraq again. Project for a New American Century, Likud, Saudi Arabia. There were these vested interests that wanted certain things out of Iraq, certain things out of that part of the Middle East. But when it comes to Afghanistan, you can talk about the rare earth elements, but like, again, it's Afghanistan's not the only place for them. The amount of rare earth elements in Afghanistan actually is less than half of what we spent on this country, both in terms of the war and in terms
Yeah.
of reconstruction. So it, I don't know, maybe that was just a bad call, a bad investment that they did that. But again, I doubt it was for that, especially considering the fact like we have other ways of getting them even out of first world countries at this point. Again, when it comes to the rare earth elements, I'm not an expert. I'm not a geologist. I'm no scientist about this, but it's not like copper. It's not like iron. It's not like gold, where you go down in the mine with your pickaxe and beat away at it for 20 hours a day. It's where you refine what's in the soil to get these rare earth elements. And again, Afghanistan does have rich soil for that, but certainly not the richest in the world, and certainly can be done safer and more cost effectively in various other parts of the world. And of course, you could say, well, yeah, it's right there. It's right next to Iran. That was the big target of the PNAC people, which, I mean, admittedly is true. I think it's projecting a bit too far in the future to say we need that Central Asian pivot against Russia and China. Now, maybe we need that Central Asian pivot isn't too far, but against Russia and China specifically, I don't think Bush or his strategist or even the Obama era strategists were thinking that far in the future at that point with the state of Russia and China and our relations with Russia and China at that point. But it does make you wonder, like like I said, you can point to ulterior motives in Iraq, in Syria, in a lot of these other conflicts in Libya. But even when it comes to trying to find ulterior motives for Afghanistan, I still find myself at a loss trying to figure out what the hell were we doing there.
Yeah, it's baffling. I mean, the other explanation was, of course, to prevent other countries from taking over that territory. And but when you look back at 2001, like, I'm sure that played a role. I mean, and no country, but especially America, is going to do something for one reason only. One reason is usually not enough, no matter how important that reason is. That's something you do when you're in dire straits, when there is a far more pressing issue. But 20 years ago, America was not that country, and it was not in that position. So yeah, it's baffling. You know, Part of it was to keep an eye on, let's say, Iran mostly, to essentially surround Iran, because the war with Iraq had not gone the way America had wanted. Um, it was a bloody war, and it cost both those countries. But ultimately, it did not change the regime or the government. I shouldn't call it a regime. It did not change the government in Iran. As I think was one of the things that they hoped for. Afghanistan, I think, also they're obligated by the mainline narrative too. Osama bin Laden is in Afghanistan. We're told right now. The Taliban said, if you want him, we can give him to you, but they said no, and that's really what kind of gives it away, right? Like, I think the Taliban were willing to come forward and give this guy away. But America did not, still said it was going to go in and, change the nature of that country. Who knows? There were two contingency plans. One was far more involved, and it would have taken months, twice as many months. So they would have gone in, let's say, March, February of 2002, rather than November of 2001. So maybe there was, overestimation. It's kind of, I think, a scenario of bad planning and then sticking to it. In other words, the foundation was suspect from the beginning, and what that did is it's set up basically a plan that could never deliver what it is that they, as best as we can guess, that they wanted, which would have been, let's say, a quote unquote more democratic uh, Afghanistan. Let's say the Afghanistan with the city of Kabul more like the way it was in the 70s.
And not that I'm saying Afghanistan was ever winnable, so to speak, but I do think a large part of the failure in Afghanistan comes down to the mentality we got from the first Gulf War when we pushed Saddam out of Kuwait with virtually no casualties. I think most of our casualties in that war came from friendly fire, believe it or not, to the point where we thought we could send in this small, highly trained strike force with overwhelming air power. Of course, in the case of Iraq and Kuwait, much more developed countries where you can hit these supply lines on the roads, hit these Iraqi tanks, etc., hit this infrastructure. But when you're doing that to a country that is fundamentally sub third world, honestly, when it comes to Afghan infrastructure,
Mhm.
you're you're not going to do that. You're not going to do a highway of death in Afghanistan, so to speak. It's just not going to happen. These people are just going to retreat in the caves and wait you out like they always do. And One thing I'll go back to is a lot of people talk about the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. Talk about, well, the Soviet Union were responsible for upwards of 7 to 10% of the Afghan population. Again, like that is a very high, staggering number. But you also have to admit, when it comes to war, especially in war of this nature, you could at least tell that no matter how brutal they had to be, they were dedicated to some sort of victory, even if that meant
Hmm.
a very crushing counterinsurgency that had very little regard for civilian casualties, so to speak. But the unfortunate nature of these kind of wars, in which why I think we're just best to stay out of them altogether, is if you actually want to win them, you're not going to win the hearts and minds of the people. You're not going to build them wells and schools and teach them gender studies. You have to wage a counterinsurgency. You have to strike fear in the heart of these people in order to get them to submit to you. Now, that's a pretty tall order for Afghanistan with what they've endured over since the beginning of their nation, really, since their ethnogenesis. But point being is, more or less, you have to wage that scorched earth campaign. You have to wage that. Again, you just have to go full throttle. We make no distinction. If we even so much suspect you as cooperating with our enemy, you're done for. Which it was strange because in these Middle Eastern wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, we had this simultaneous over application of force and under application of force. Where like we would go in, we would just put the boot down, but just in all the wrong areas, just against all the wrong people to the point where, and then when it's actual things that you could do to quote unquote win these wars that you bumbled us into in the first place, there's just nothing to be done. And somebody was talking about this the other day, and I found this quite interesting. Now, of course, post 9/11, about the decade and a half afterwards, since about 2015, 2016, you saw, of course, that media push, as a country does in wartime, to again make this heroism propaganda. And again, I'm going to say, it's very nuanced. I mean, I think anyone willing to pick up a gun and go, fight against, some of those hardened fighters in the world in a desert, that's certainly admirable to some degree. But what I will say with this, again, it was this propaganda push to more or less retroactively justify why the hell we've spent 15 years in Afghanistan. You think these movies like Zero Dark 30, Lone Survivor, American Sniper, and a lot of them were admittedly, even by the people who made them and the people again, and by the military itself, saying, well, yeah, these are an embellishment. They're feel good stories. I mean, pretty much outright telling us, hey, these are propaganda films. And again, you saw all of those crop up again as more or less a post hoc justification to these wars. But you know what they haven't made a movie about? One of the
Mm.
biggest battles that the United States participated in since September 11th. They never talk about Fallujah, and that was some like that's like
Right,
some of the,
right.
like the
Good
grittiest
point.
like 2005 Iraqi counterinsurgency, like grittiest urban warfare where again you had these 18-year-old 19-year-old kids who signed up after they watched the towers fall in order to go try to root out former Saddamists in Fallujah. And somebody, I can't remember who put it together. It was somebody on Twitter where they put together this thing like saying, well, yeah, all these movies, all these great things focus on a lot of these like highly trained special force guys, whether they're SEALs, whether they're just any other sort of special forces, and it focuses on them, but never once in terms of talking about these wars and portraying these wars to the American public do you hear about, again, those 18, 19-year-old kids who were pretty much, fresh out of training by the time they got sent over into probably one of the grittiest battles of, I would say, I mean, I think it's unfair to say the post World War II era, but definitely I would say since Vietnam.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to watch in the next few days and few weeks. What is going to happen? I know Britain is saying that they are going to, for the sake of the evacuation of whatever people it still has there, and this applies also for America. America, in fact, is sending 9,000 troops in order to facilitate the with complete withdrawal from Afghanistan. Also, forget Mohammed Ashraf Ghani. He's no, I forget what his role is, but anyhow, the U.S. Secretary of State and of Defense has asked him to resign. I mean, this is pretty big news. It's speculative at the moment, but I, I'm gonna say I don't doubt this. So they're asking him to step down in order to have, uh, you know, a peaceful surrender, so to speak. Um, yeah, I don't know how many troops Britain is sending, but yeah, Kirby says that they're going to send 3,000 U.S. troops. So it is kind of going. It could we could see some iconic images, the kind that we saw way back in '75 as people were leaving the U.S. embassy in Saigon with that one lone helicopter on the rooftop and a staircase filled with people waiting to get into the helicopter. Um, I mean, what the impact this is going to have worldwide is going to be immense. We're going to have, I mean, for Europe particularly, expect thousands, hundreds of thousands of refugees. Um, Countries like Pakistan and Iran are already beyond coping with the refugees that they've had there for well over a decade.
And you
I
have to
mean,
remember,
well
Iran,
over
like
a decade.
in 2018, 2019, was being very hardball with the U.S. and the Western powers when it came to the nuclear negotiations, saying, "Look, we have 2 million Afghans sitting in our country. What's to stop us from sending them to you?" Sort of doing the same thing Turkey does, and again,
Yeah,
just be passing the buck from Iran to Turkey to the Western world at large. And again, once you get this mass exodus from Afghanistan, assuming that what happens, actually does happen, or I don't know, maybe the Taliban will lead a very, stable tribal government. Who knows? Whatever. But point being is, it's going to change the entire dynamic. We're probably going to get another migrant crisis as we saw in 2015, 2016. Much of the U.S. credibility is, again, as you're talking about, we're probably going to get some recreations of these photos after the
yeah,
fall of Saigon from Vietnam. Like on top of everything else with the Biden administration, the U.S. is going to look completely impotent.
yeah,
Yeah, I would expect between those two factors, the refugees and that, you'll probably see another sharp rise in Euroscepticism and nationalism in these various European countries. With the French elections coming up, the German elections coming up, parties like the National Rally, the AFD in Germany, of course, Lega, and the FDI in Italy. The just again the various right wing parties and movements throughout Europe. Now, whether you think they're good or whether they're just more sellouts who are just pretending to be on our side, but point being is the sentiments in Europe, the sentiments in the Western world are likely going to, between these two events in particular and other events as well, continue that sharp veer to the right to more nationalistic policies. And again, we'll see how that plays out. We'll see how the U.S. maneuvers itself there. But we're at the point where, under Trump, more nationalistic policies implied a friendly relation with the United States, and Trump was sort of the global figurehead of this movement. But now that he's gone, there's no real American successor to him. I could see these European countries not only being very Eurosceptic, but a very American skeptic as well.
hmm yeah. We talk about the war in Syria and why did America go in and a lot of these wars are fought. Even maybe to harken back to what I was saying um, about the evolution of war, and let's say the evolution of war in modernity, but let's say in post-modernity, right? In a way, like America rationalizes a lot of these wars because of its close ties to the military-industrial complex, right? So they can make money for them. They can make money for Bilderberger, for instance, right? I mean, everybody is well aware of this. It was well discovered and well revealed after the 9/11 attacks and the war in Afghanistan, and then subsequently in Iraq. So a lot of these wars are kind of just like they're really economic wars with like semi to medium high intensity fighting, but ultimately there are limits. And one of those limits, as you pointed out, is how much more American adventurism is Europe willing to take? I know America has been taking in about 1 million illegal refugees for the last 20 years. Now, how many are sent back? How many come back in? But it's roughly around 1 million. And Europe has even less capacity to deal with this. It's also it's less unified. It's not federalized in the way that America is. So you'll have these countries. Like, how much more of this can go on before they shoot themselves in the foot? I think we are reaching the limit here. Like, we mentioned Iran and Turkey and Pakistan. Well, in Turkey right now, there are protests, and you're seeing mobs burning down shops, attacking Arab refugees in the streets. Apparently, there was a woman that I think was killed recently by one of these refugees. So, of course, they're going back all the refugees. Well, in other words, like, I mean, Iran is talking about 2 million. Erdogan is up to 4 million. And Jordan has no more capacity for this anymore. Even Lebanon has its Syrian refugees. How, like, what is the cost of winning? These are all potentially, at best, they're Pyrrhic victories.
Yeah, and that's
There,
you know
there will
that's
all be.
that's another point I want to touch on with Syria. You saw a sudden change of heart over the past couple of years of these Arab League countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, etc. All of a sudden willing to accept Syria back into their community, accept them, and not treat them as pariah state when they reach maximum capacity with the refugees. Pretty much saying it's time for these people to go home. We've lost the war, and again, for the United States, which of course has its immigration issues, immigration debate. Of course, the southern border is very contentious, as I'm sure you all know. In terms of Middle Eastern wars, we haven't really seen the human waves that come out of those. Again, it's been more concentrated to continental Europe and Middle East. Again, a lot of very strategic partners, no less. So it's again, it does. You have a great point when it comes to how much more a lot of these countries are going to tolerate when it comes to this. And I think that's why in 2015, 2016, you saw a big push for refugees welcome in these Western countries, and that was one of the big issues of the 2016 debate. How many refugees should we let in? Should we let in any at all? Of course, Trump was more on the skeptical side of that. And I think what we saw with that playing out in particular is the the bureaucrats in Washington, wherever, saw that Turkey, Jordan, whoever, they can only take so much of this. So maybe in order to continue our adventurous policy, so to speak, maybe we have to bite the bullet and take these people in ourselves. I think that was probably a real consideration within Washington within the late Obama era that this simply cannot go on. Simply, these countries will have enough, and I think we've gotten to the point where they have had enough. Considering the fact the main impetus for the Turkish intervention in Syria, of course, not the only one, was the resettlement of these people in these Kurdish-controlled areas. Now, keep in mind the so-called SDF, the Kurdish-controlled areas. Just to pull up the maps, just to give you perspective of how much they control. Again, it's all of that in yellow. Like, yeah, of course, the Kurds are in charge there, and the SDF is in charge there, so-called multiracial, multi-ethnic group. But most of the population is Syrian Arab. So it's again, you get that case again. So when Turkey, again, not defending Turkey as a country or Erdogan as a person or a leader, but when they push in and create like these safe zones and put these Syrian refugees back in this area, they're not exactly pushing these Kurds out of their land. The Kurds are very sparse, nomadic people in the first place. It's just saying, well, yeah, these areas have been occupied by Arabs since the 7th century, and we've just reached our limit with these refugees, and we're trying to create zones so they can actually return to their home countries now. And again, you've seen it, funny enough, in Europe, a lot of the actual Syrian refugees, which out of the refugee crisis of 2015, 2016, I think they estimated only 30% of the refugees were from either Iraq or Syria. Well, those ones mostly have repatriated. They've gone home. They don't want to stay in Europe. They want to go home. Whereas you get a lot of these economic migrants, people who weren't really in the
Right.
danger of war, whether that be, again, Algerians, these other people from North Africa, or, again, maybe they might actually be Iraqi or Syrian themselves, or even Kurdish, which I probably get counted like that just in the demographic head count, who weren't really in danger of the ongoing wars there, but just said, hey, there's more economic opportunity in the West. But point being is, all the ones who had wanted to repatriate by now, especially to Syria, have already because the situation has more or less stabilized.
Yeah, I mean those are excellent points. And it is very interesting because um, early on, I mean, people knew that there were enormous portions of these refugees who were not actually from Syria, and indeed many of them were economic migrants. There weren't refugees, and so you know to circle back to Afghanistan, there's going to be all kinds of people who will either lie about their nationality, but they will use Afghanistan one way or another to try to flood into Europe. And like I say, you can keep you can keep fighting these wars that ultimately don't change life on the ground for the people once you've like invaded and fought the country for over a decade, but the consequences thereafter, like I mean, it's only a small select people within the elites that are going to make money from this, and this kind of hubris is going
And
to
that's also to the
bite them
detriment
back.
of other elites who are losing out on money because of these policies.
Yeah, well, that's a good point too. Yeah, so I mean, how much? I'm just amazed. Like, uh, how much longer is this going to go on? Uh, like refugees, by the way, are still and migrants, mostly migrants, are still flooding into Europe. But I mean, we're talking about another wave, the kind that we saw in 2015 and 16. And I don't know if Europe can handle another one of those. I don't think so. And I think when Turkey last year threatened that it would release, or was it the year before that it threatened it would release something like 700 to a million refugees into Europe. I mean, you saw, the Danish Navy show up to to support the Greeks and stopping him from doing that. So
I mean,
I don't think
Turkey
it's
would be
there.
wise, and the European elite would be off their rocker if they were going to allow this sort of situation on the eve of the German and French elections, mind you. Because we got German elections next
Right,
month, we have
right,
French elections this upcoming April 2022. And there is no way in hell even the most vampiric neoliberal, even again to the level of Donald Tusk, people like that, would have the hubris or the ideological fervor to say, let's let in a, a million more people on the eve of the elections in two of the most pitiful countries in Europe, where a Eurosceptic, uh, migration skeptic right wing parties have chances of maybe not so much winning, even though victory is a possibility, but of at least influencing government policy. There's no way in hell they're going to let that happen. And Turkey would be very wise right now to milk this situation for everything they can. And I expect Erdogan to, honestly.
right, right. No, I think you're right. I mean, he knows they're gunning for him, and he needs leverage, and this is his leverage. Perhaps that's why he's so confident. Because he is confident. He's more confident than anybody else in his position would be. Yeah. So, I mean, we're already there. Uh, uh, the second largest city in Afghanistan has fallen. This is a big deal. I think we all know where this is going. Like honestly, if the West doesn't step in um, to quote unquote save the day, I think for sure we're looking at another mass migration. And to ask, let's say, Middle Eastern and Central Asian countries to foot the bill and house the refugees. Um, I don't know. I mean, in order to avoid Europe taking the burden, um, America is going to have to do some wheeling and dealing if it's really interested in that, and I don't think they are.
Well, like you were saying, and I think this goes back to my further point about France and Germany. There's there's no winning move here for the West.
Yeah,
I don't think there's
there's
an ace
fun.
up Biden sleeve or an ace up Merkel or Macron sleeve, especially Merkel, who I don't know, being a lame duck, being within her last month of office, last few months of office, may decide to do something that she would have normally never done and really draw a line in the sand, if you will. And yeah, again, because there is no conceivable winning move in this situation right now. And it's not even the old cliche that, the only winning move is not to play. Too late. We're well within the game. We're at the end of the game right now.
Yeah,
It's too
yeah,
late to back out from that now. So I don't know what the hell they're going to do, but it's certainly, strange enough for people who are more of our mindset, for people who are more in line with us, there is abundant opportunity. I'm actually feeling optimistic for the first time in a few years. I mean, your Slavic genes probably have some sort of immune response to that, so I won't even ask you. But yeah, like there's certainly opportunity to be had within this upcoming situation for the more illiberal-minded people. But in terms of, again, this is a real rock and a hard place for the liberal establishment the past 30, if not even 100 years. I'll say what I said at the beginning of the show. This is a watershed moment.
yes, yes, it is. I mean, if from a strictly pragmatic point of view, right? If you don't want a populist movement, right? Um, don't cause wars to benefit a small elite and make other societies that are contributing, let's say, very little to it. Uh, you know, don't bring in hundreds of thousands or millions of migrants and refugees. Um, this is so much worse than 2015, though, because we're dealing with a recession and we're dealing with the contradictions of COVID,
Oh, of course, and it just a
right?
complete loss of credibility of the regime because even before then there were again signs of fracturing, but it's to the point where we've had years of continuous protest, on and off protests, I should say, in various Western countries, whether it be the United States, France, Germany, Italy, the UK, again to the point where these regimes have spurned their credibility, especially over the past 5 years. We're on a looming economic crisis. We still have, again, this coronavirus debacle to deal with.
Yeah.
However, they're going to respond to this again. It's going to be quite the mental gymnastics to watch. We need to stay safe. We need to take these health precautions while letting in, again, countless people from countries for sure cannot mass vaccinate their populations. And again, you just have the general contradictions of liberalism, and it's all coming together in what one, depending on your point of view, could call the perfect or most disastrous storm. I would say we've seen now. Again, I speculate. I know this century is still young. It's only 2021. People said 9/11 was the pivotal moment of this. People said the Arab Spring, Russian annexation of Crimea, rise of China. I think we're looking at an event that can join the ranks of that right now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all you have to do to cause trouble is repeat 2015, and this is far worse than that, right? I mean, people notice when you bring in migrant workers into Ireland
Oh, of course. And I mean,
in the tens of thousands while everybody else is on lockdown.
when Turkey
People
tried to repeat
understand that,
that in 2019, 2020, there was
right,
outrage. And like I said, on the
right.
eve of two major European elections that are just over 6 months apart from each other, this is a recipe for disaster if you're a neoliberal elite in Washington, Brussels, London, Paris, Berlin, etc. This is your worst nightmare come to pass, and deep down you know that it's your own damn fault.
Yeah, and how much longer are you going to just accuse people of being racist for it just inherently weakening their societies?
Yeah, I mean, Denmark's
While
neoliberal
you go
government
around
won in a
basically
landslide on immigration restriction policies. Changed nothing else. Again, you saw Macron try to take this pivot where, it's going to be all the same neoliberal hellscape policies, except we think we might be a little over capacity and we might need some room to control ourselves. And that's on top of these retired French military officers writing this letter saying, we can't take much more of this situation. It's going to boil over eventually. Just keep that in consideration too. That you just had
Mhm.
2.5 months ago, 20 retired French generals saying you're turning this country into a powder keg, and that this will end horribly unless you do something right now. Straight to the president of France, again on the eve of an election, within a year of an upcoming election. So I mean, what do you think's going to happen? What do you think's going to happen? That's not just you. That's a
Yeah,
general. That's just a general question to our audience, who probably has a better idea. To the general public, anyone who might stumble across this by accident and be completely diametrically opposed to our worldview. What do you think is going to come out of this? I can tell you what I think is going to come out of this. I have very extensively, including in this episode. But man, I knew this was a looming crisis, but it just feels so much more real and immediate now after the fall of Kandahar that I'm telling you, by beginning of next year, I'm just saying, as much as I've joked about fleeing to Sicily, I'm kind of glad I'm not a European right now. And that's coming
hmm
from
hmm
somebody who is currently living in um, the downward spiral of North America. Now, fortunately, I'm in red state America. I know you're I know you're unfortunate enough to be in one of the liberal epicenters of this continent, which I do deeply pity you
yeah,
for. Don't get me wrong, but man, I trashed a lot, I complain a lot, but all things considered, red state America might be a very comfy place right now, in terms
mm,
of the Western world at least.
yeah, no doubt. Yeah, there's fewer and fewer places I think that have any kind of long-term certainty.
But I suppose that's all I had for this episode, at least.
Yeah, that's it for me.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning into this. I would say a bit doomy and gloomy episode of the War Report. I hope you enjoyed, but we got to have these kind of episodes sometimes. But you know what? Where there is this sort of loss of hope in some people's eyes, I see abundant opportunity. And no, I'm not trying to sell you something, at least not yet. I'm not that savvy enough to e-beg. Maybe someday. I used to try it, wasn't very successful. Maybe I'll find out a way for you people to give me my rightful earnings for the show that I just labor so hard for you all for. But no, I actually kind of like keeping it as a non-profit organization. By that I mean we don't make any profit. It's more fun that way. It's more of a hobby that way, and it's just one of those things. So before I turn this into a 2-hour episode, I'm going to let you guys go. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.